Composition, positioning, and layout. These ideas are so important in a photographer's foundational skill set that even though I've already made quite a comprehensive video on this in my visual pattern series on YouTube, again, it's worth repeating here, even at the risk of you having already watched that video, because it is that important. And if you have watched that video before, then hey, a good refresher never hurts. As photographers, we have the ability to consciously include or exclude absolutely everything in our composition. Yes, absolutely everything. That random bird that flew into our landscape, yep, that's our fault. We pressed the shutter. The random hairs in the face of our model, yep, that's our fault as well. We pressed the shutter. The unleveled horizon in our cityscape, yep, that's our fault again. As photographers, we are absolutely responsible for every single thing that makes its way onto the sensor and out as an image. And we have a tremendously flexible way to be able to organize all of the elements within our composition as well. And when I say the word composition, I'm referring to the entire image. I'm referring to how you compose the image. When you think of the word compose, it implies that you are responsible for what goes in it, everything that goes in it, and we most certainly are, through the use of positioning and laying out our elements in our composition. When we position our elements, regardless of whether that's in portraiture or landscape or street photography or otherwise, we do this by a combination of physically moving the camera up, down, left, or right, or physically moving ourselves half a step to the left, or 10 meters to the right, or 10 meters down the road, or up on a ladder, or squatting down, or whatever the case may be. We also position our elements by timing and prediction as well, whether that's knowing where the sun is going to rise from and planning our compositions around that the second that the sun pops its head out, or whether that's setting up a street shot and waiting for someone to walk through it to complete the composition. Whatever the case may be, timing matters as well. We do all of this so that we can be responsible for what eventually makes its way onto the sensor and out as a photograph. We're intentionally positioning our elements and laying them out because we're responsible for every single element and its positioning within our images. Owning this sense of responsibility over your images is when the game really changes for your photography. This is the point where you've gone out and taken a bunch of images and you're reviewing them, and some images just, they don't seem right. But you're able to say, hey, maybe next time if I approach a scene like this, if I take half a step to the left and squat down next time, I'll be able to change up my levels a little bit more and the composition might look a little bit more grand and it'll look better. Or if I just went 10 meters down the road here, then, I could have got a completely different shot to everyone else who was at this spot, and I could have made my compositions just a little bit more unique. Or next time I'm shooting a model, I'm going to make sure that I'm on the same level as their eyes because shooting up into the face wasn't flattering on their cheeks. And a whole other bunch of different scenarios that involve the ever so slight movement of yourself or the camera so that you can then reframe your composition the perfect way every single time. Once you start to get good at this, you'll be able to look at a location and think to yourself, this is the type of shot that I typically gravitate towards, and this is the style of shot that I typically go for in this situation. And I need to stand in exactly this spot in order to achieve this spot that I typically go for. You'll be able to envision any scenario and know where the best shot is for you because you've practiced it over and over and over again. For example, for me, I now use Google Earth and Google Street View on maps all of the time because I'm able to mentally go to a location ahead of time and use it to scout out the location, and then I can envision the best shot for that location before I'm even there. And that thought experiment allows me to be way more prepared when I actually eventually do make it to that location, and it saves me so much time because I've already thought about all of the compositions that I want to get in that location. But before we get too ahead of ourselves here, let's talk about layout, because strong compositions often abide by perhaps the closest thing to photography rules as you're going to get. These compositional structures, as I call them, are predetermined ways that we can lay out our images. They're visual patterns, and so these layouts again have an implied meaning to them. That is, when they're used correctly, they can make subjects seem stronger, or they can make the viewer's focus hone in quicker, or they can be more immediately understandable to the majority of viewers. All of these are desirable things that we would want in our image. However, again, when you break these structures, they lose their implied meaning. That's not to say that you should always abide by the rules. You do what you want. It's your image after all. But I say that if you do so with intention and know what you're doing when you do it. Don't just break a rule and then call it artsy. Don't fall into accepting your mistakes and justifying them for being mistakes. Learn from them so that you can then improve on them next time. In any case, I will cover a few compositional structures here so that we can get the ball rolling with this. But again, check out the YouTube video on my visual pattern playlist so that you can get another deep dive into it. The rule of thirds is the quintessential layout and positioning tool. You can get overlays for it on every camera, on any photo editing piece of software, almost any device that you can take or view a photo on. It is that ubiquitous. Therefore, it is worth learning. The rule of thirds is still something that is perhaps my most commonly used compositional structure for layout, and that's probably not going to change anytime soon. Now, how it works is that the rule of thirds is a composition that is broken up by 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines, evenly spaced out to create 9 areas or zones. Now, because of the way that these lines are divided and spaced, when you place elements on these lines, they appear stronger or they take up more visual weight than they were if you were to place the elements in a random spot. And this comes from a natural hierarchy of proportion that's achieved when you place the elements on these lines. Analytically, it's the spacing that helps you achieve this natural hierarchy, and that's what this rule is all about. Hierarchy. This was the very original intention of the painter John Thomas Smith, who first named and created this layout in 1797. The original idea of the rule of thirds layout is about, quote, 2 distinct equal lights should never appear in the same picture. One should be principal and the rest subordinate, both in dimension and degree. What he's talking about here is the idea of visual hierarchy. Therefore, the most striking and visually interesting images always have a primary subject that serves as the principal idea, and the rest of the image is of lesser hierarchy or subordinate. He then goes to show that the main subject should always be on one of those lines of the rule of thirds. Since then, the rule of thirds has been adapted over time to talk a lot about the intersection of the lines as well. The 4 lines create 4 intersection points that also create an inner square, and it is said that placing elements on these intersections is perhaps the strongest positions out of all of the rule of thirds. And I don't specifically agree with this idea, but it is an interesting point to think about nonetheless, and discovering if you yourself like it and cherish it for that reason. The center compositional structure is perhaps the most basic, I guess, in my opinion, but don't let that fool you, because it's perhaps the strongest out of all of the compositional structures, in my opinion. Quite simply, the center compositional structure is where you put your element dead center, but it also extends outwards towards the edges of the composition as well, creating both a vertical and a horizontal cross throughout the frame. Now, there's a kind of funny journey that happens with some photographers, myself included. When photographers first start out, they tend to put many of their subjects right in the middle. I mean, it's human nature to do so after all, right? But because of that, that's why many people think of it as basic. And then by virtue of people wanting to, improve themselves, they then move on to different compositional structures, and then they don't ever return back to using the center compositional structure for quite some time. Then eventually, when they're working their way up towards mastery, they have a more holistic view of compositional structures and realize that there's a time and a place for everything, and that the center compositional structure is actually really strong for many reasons, and it's not basic at all. and then they start to use it again. It's a bit of a cycle, this one, and I've seen it happen so many times with so many photographers for this specific compositional structure over any other compositional structures, and it is kind of hilarious actually. But the main takeaway is that things in the center are very, very strong. But let's stop to consider why this is so. Why is there such a natural inclination to put our subjects in the middle? Well, that's because as humans, when we see a photograph or when we see anything at all, really, we automatically try and understand the context of the thing that we're looking at as fast as possible so that we can then assess what we're really looking at with the full understanding of the situation. And this is the case whether you are watching a video, walking into a classroom, into a restaurant, whatever the case may be. Situational awareness is always context driven. And as it pertains to photography, our eyes are always first assessing two things: the macro context or the bounds of the image, and then the content. We look first to see if what we're looking at is a phone or a monitor or a TV or whatever it is. And then because our eyes are always assessing the bounds of the image first and foremost before anything, we automatically also find the center of those bounds first and foremost as well. It's all about orienting yourself and people's orientation when it comes to their vision. And this is why everyone defaults to the center. That's why, even though this idea is basic, it's also perhaps the strongest compositional structure. It's one that is the most identifiable and immediately easiest to understand. If you put your element in the very center of the image, it's almost as if the rest of the image doesn't even matter. Of course it does, but because we're so quickly able to triangulate exactly where to look initially, the rest of the interpretation of the image is just as easy and quick to understand. So, center. Don't just write it off as being basic. It is an incredibly powerful tool to understand and to use. Now, there are a bunch of other different compositional structures that you could potentially use as well. There's a whole bunch around what's called the golden ratio, including the golden triangle and the Fibonacci spiral. And there's a whole bunch of other simpler ones like diagonals and squares and so many more. However, in my opinion, while they're all fun to learn and more information is better than none, I would actually highly recommend that at this stage in your photography journey, to only focus on the rule of thirds and center as your first compositional structures, because in my opinion, they'll take you 90% of the way there. And hey, you're doing this course right now because you want to learn the most efficient and effective way to learn. And man, in my opinion, this is it. As you progress along your photography journey, sure, feel free to visit different compositional structures and mix up your images and experiment to see what's right for you and what you tend to gravitate towards the most. But if you are looking for the most bang for your buck and learning techniques that are worth your time and will take you the farthest, then rule of thirds and center is the way to go, in my opinion. I mean, I've been doing visual language across so many different disciplines for over 15 years at this point, and I still use these two main compositional structures for so many things, for the majority of things. And I've experimented with every other compositional structure you can think of out there, and I still return back to those two. But of course, your photography is your photography, and you can do what you like. Okay, that was a lot about compositional structures that have a baked in implied meaning to them, but the other part that goes hand in hand with that is actually the positioning of those elements. Now, remember, like I said at the very start of the lesson, as a photographer, everything in the composition is your responsibility. Yes, wonky horizons, that random dude in the corner, blurry subjects, that misfire, all of those things are your responsibility to fix. Get intentional with the placement of your element, and you'll find that your photography will improve significantly. Now, something that helps tremendously for me is mentally composing my images before I take the shot, before I even touch that shutter button. whenever I see something that I think looks nice and I would love to take a photo of, I actually compose it in my mind's eye first before even touching my camera. I think about why I like that particular scene. I think about what the best way to express that scene is, what visual patterns I would like to use to help express that, and then how I would like to position the elements in that scene, whether or not I want a person in it, if they're going to be in the very dead center of my image, or maybe they're going to be walking through a door on the right, if a building is going to be on the bottom third of my image, or so on and so forth, all before I've even pressed the shutter button. Doing this visual exercise with almost everything that you do and see will help you be more intentional with your compositions. We have the ability to use our imagination to pre-compose images in our mind's eye, and the more we do it just in practice, the more it's just like doing the real thing in real life. Oh, and that leads me to another thing. So replication and actually doing the thing, actually taking the shot. When you imagine your positioning and laying out in this way all of the time in your mind, there will be a relationship between what your mind sees and then how you're actually able to replicate that in the real world with a camera. And as you get better at photography, you'll find that you're more and more able to replicate exactly what you see in your mind as an image. And you might even find that you start seeing the world in focal lengths, because every focal length has a different field of view and therefore requires different sizing when you're imagining these layouts and the positioning of your elements within them. And you will be able to adjust and predict how you lay out your compositions and elements in real time across the entire spectrum of focal lengths. And that's really exciting. But it takes a lot of practice. But if you train your eyes to see in this way every single day, with or without a camera, you will get there fast. All right, time for today's assignment. And today we are going to be doing squats. Yes, literal squats. So one habit that a lot of newer photographers get into is that they will, for the majority of their images, just shoot from where they're standing. And sometimes that works, but everyone does that. So what's to separate you from the person next to you taking the same shot in the same way, in the same place, doing the same thing? Nothing. So what I want you to do is start making a habit of changing your levels. Not only just shooting at the chest or at the eyepiece, but squatting, crouching, shooting above your head, moving the composition around and never locking yourself into what you think might just be the standard view. The more you're able to get active and move around, the more individual and unique your images and perspective will be, because other people just aren't doing that. So today's assignment is an exercise in mixing things up. In your shooting session today, whenever you take a shot, take it as per normal, with the viewfinder to your eye as you usually would, but then take an unconventional perspective along with it. Take the same shot, but accompany it with like a squatting shot or a crouching shot or an overhead shot, or one where you're leaning to the left or something, or leaning on a wall or whatever it might be. Do this as an exercise for every image that you take today and play around with changing your levels. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.